Hello, welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to be having you here for our I think a third installment in this careers series about transition. This is from government to trust and safety. My name is Charlotte Wilner. I am executive director here at the Trust and Safety Professional Association, or TSPA. TSPA is a nonprofit supporting the global community of professionals working in online trust and safety. So we work alongside teams and individuals to help them develop the skills and the expertise and the relationships they need to navigate this unique profession. I myself worked in trust and safety for many years before coming here to nonprofit. And there are many things I love about trust and safety. There's many things I love about my job today, but my favorite part of my job is actually getting to hear people's origin stories. Like, so when you were like, what do I want to be when I grow up? Did you want to be in trust and safety? And of course, the answer for most people is no, because that wasn't really a thing in the same way when most of us were young. And so everyone has a different origin story. And what I love about this series is we're going to get to hear from a bunch of different people about their really different origin stories and what equipped them throughout that process for the job that they have today and sort of the life that they have today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Brian Fishman, and he is going to be our moderator today. He's going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and I'll pop back up in a little bit here for some Q&A. So thank you all.
Awesome. Charlotte, thanks so much, and Crystalline and everybody at TSPA for having me and for having this group and for hosting this webinar. My name is Brian Fishman. I am the co-founder of a trust and safety tooling platform called Cinder. Prior to that, I led the work around dangerous organizations at Facebook. But my background is really as an academic studying terrorism, and I did that at West Point, which is run by the U.S. Army, and so was technically a government employee in that stead. I'm really excited that we've got an amazing panel today. I've told them that they should be as conversational as possible, and that I will be as quiet and out of the way as possible. And so we're going to let them introduce themselves, and then I'll ask some questions for a bit. And everybody watching, please do chime in with questions, and Charlotte and the TSPA team and I will try to triage those and get them to the panelists. So with that, we'll go alphabetical. So Gullnaz Baig, then Rebecca Fitzsimmons, Josh Parecki, and Drake Toney. Naz, why don't you kick us off and say hello?
Okay, hello everybody. I'm based out of Singapore, so I'm fresh and bright today, and a bit chirpier probably because I'm still high on energy. Might not be the case in a few hours, but never mind. I used to work for Brian, so I used to be on the dangerous organizations team. When we joined, it was the counterterrorism team, based out of Singapore, looking after APAC. So it was a very interesting gig. And we can talk about how I stumbled into that later on. And after Facebook, I sort of stumbled across different tech companies, including Twitter and TikTok. So that can also be an interesting conversation. But before I stumbled into tech, I was a policy officer for the Singapore government, supporting and looking at how we can build out our national education policies and also profile it on the international stage, while at the same time supporting various political office holders in the education portfolio. So that's a bit about me. Today, I sort of hold two hats. I lead a network of trust and safety professionals based out of Asia Pacific, and we advise on how to make tech safer for various communities. And at the same time, I'm also executive director of a council that looks at talking about technological development within Southeast Asia to a global audience. So that's a bit about myself. Over to you, Rebecca, I think.
Yes, thank you. So I'm Rebecca Fitzsimmons, and I had, for the majority of my career, about 14 and a half years, I was a special agent with our United States federal government. The majority of those years were with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS. And with NCIS, my career, it took me around the world. I was able to visit Singapore, as we were talking about earlier, I lived all over the United States, worked all over, and I was even stationed abroad in Italy for several years. And as a civilian federal law enforcement agency, our mission, or three main strategic priorities, if you will, were to investigate felony level crime, to protect secrets, and to prevent terrorism. And that applies to our United States Marine Corps, our United States Navy, and anything with that nexus with the Department of Navy was our purview. Let's see, in 2016, I entered the leadership ranks, and I have been in leadership roles ever since. I am so very passionate about leadership, and I have been blessed, and I'm incredibly grateful for amazing teams, not only in NCIS, but certainly here at Thumbtack, which leads me to present day. In early February 22, I made the big transition into tech, which is why I'm having this conversation with all of you this evening, and I joined Thumbtack. So currently I am head of our Critical Escalations and Privacy team here in Trust and Safety at Thumbtack. And in this capacity, I oversee the more high risk and sensitive cases that could impact our users, as well as background check adjudication, pro identity verification, and data privacy. So that is my career snapshot. And I just want to say really quickly, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really excited to hear from my fellow panelists and to share a little bit about my story. And who is next? Is it Drake?
It's me.
Okay,
Sure.
over to you.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Parecki. I currently I lead the trust and safety team at Zoom, the platform brought to you by, I guess, today. I started with Zoom and right about when it mattered, from a safety perspective, which was in the first week of June of 2020, and we've been building our team ever since. I'm incredibly proud of the mighty trust and safety team that we've built at Zoom, and the only reason I can talk about good things is because really of them. Before that, I was still in the public sector, or private sector rather. So I was also an attorney at the ExxonMobil Corporation, and before that, I was a federal prosecutor for about 8 years, and then before part of that, I was also at the United States Department of Justice, what we call Main Justice, where I was part of what was called the National Security Division, counterterrorism section, which sort of worked on coordinating counterterrorism prosecutions all around the world, and also allowed me to travel quite a bit to think about how we could do counterterrorism prosecutions. And then culminated in time where I was the counsel for the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division, and spent a little bit of time hanging out at the White House working on counterterrorism policy. So lots of fun stuff, and I'm really excited to be here. And I really enjoy trust and safety and the fun and exciting challenges it brings. So look forward to talking about it.
Awesome. Drake?
Yes, thank you. Thanks to everybody. Josh, you're a tough act to follow. That's a super impressive resume. I kind of came into my professional career through active duty service in the Marine Corps. I'm still a drilling reservist. I'm getting set to go out kind of next year on a Marine Expeditionary Unit deployment. So, some things to maybe talk about later about continuing service through private sector career. But as a U.S. Marine, I'm fortunate to have not met Rebecca until today. So no run-ins with NCIS to date, which is exciting. After active duty service, I went into the exciting world of business continuity and IT disaster recovery consulting, and then kind of stumbled into tech that way with portfolio of clients, and understanding that my experience was actually more relevant than I may have thought. So in my Marine service, I worked mostly on the civil affairs side, so working with kind of State Department folks, NGOs, IGOs, and then understanding kind of community building and kind of the post-Iraq, Afghanistan time. Working through kind of a career at Twitter, learned a lot about kind of the emerging field, worked closely with trust and safety, but also worked in adjacent teams. Made a really interesting decision to go back to the US government as a GS employee and work in the DoD. So spent some time in the Pentagon. That's why I wore my jacket today for this panel, and spent time in kind of the 3-star directorate that was looking after the consolidation of kind of like all our non-kinetic capabilities, as the Marine Corps has made a pivot in how they're kind of doing like the mission approach under the new commandant, or the current commandant and force design. And so now I'm kind of back into the private sector working at Spotify. So I lead strategy and operations for trust and safety at Spotify. It's really energizing to kind of bring the business side, thinking about kind of the big machine that has to move, and supporting a complex mission that gets more complex every day with generative AI, large language models, all the things that you all, both on the panel and probably tuned in, are dealing with every day. So excited to talk about that journey, but still, I guess, a little bit affiliated and recovering at the same time from government service.
Yeah, Drake, that's a really interesting dynamic with what does it mean to be a sort of reservist, and balancing that with these, your obligations as a trust and safety professional. I'm gonna this is a question for the whole panel, but maybe we'll sort of go in reverse order. But Drake, what was one of the things that surprised you most about working in trust and safety? Was it similarities to government service? Was it the differences from government service? What was it that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I think I guess like I would say like what I would highlight is the challenge. So I think like what I found challenging or that was surprising was maybe folks had such a laser focus on a particular issue. So like policy professionals, folks that like really worked hands-on on a particular kind of functional area or subject matter expertise, whether they came from academia or, they just had built a really strong body of work. I coming from government and just personally, I'm more of a generalist. And so I think like my strength is that I can see the enterprise. I see how like, procurement or program management really relates to the delivery of a critical service, or how, the pieces need to fit together. And so I found myself, I thought I would be kind of one of many generalists, but I found myself in the trust and safety space being among folks that could, speak to great specificity, and then figuring out how to kind of get those folks aligned in department level goals, or to think about, aligning that skill set to serve, company priorities. Those were challenges, and those were kind of surprising. I kind of thought folks would be in the space and really understand, the platform or the service or the business, and really, they deeply understood, an area of harm or threat, or, one of those kind of challenge areas. And so that's been surprising, but I think like where I've really learned a lot from the talented people I work with, and where I think like I've kind of been able to build a niche and, generate value, and that's really rooted in the government service too.
Yeah.
So I would say just quickly, two things interesting. Like one thing that carries over from government into trust and safety is mission. Like it's one of those things that like maybe doesn't necessarily translate in other parts of the tech community, but like in trust and safety, there is a mission, and it's really to try to keep people safe. I'm oversimplifying, but that's nice. And if you're somebody that's worked for the government, especially in the fields that I think everybody here has, that's just an easy transition. I think the biggest challenge is I think when you're in the government, you underestimate the complexity of the challenge, right? I mean, I still recall being at the Department of Justice, and I've heard my former boss opine on this, but leading up to the Supreme Court cases this past summer, but it's not so easy when you talk about, and everybody here has some experience about this, like radicalizing with YouTube videos and algorithms. And sometimes when you're in the government side, it is easy in your head. You're like, there are bad videos, they're online, we should be doing more about it. And then when you come on the inside, you realize that's really hard. That's hard. It's really a complex problem. Doesn't mean that's not one we're working on, constantly and tirelessly, but it's a really, really hard problem.
Yeah. Rebecca, Naz?
Yeah, I would, I probably will have like a different approach to answering the question, but I just wanted to kind of echo both Josh and Drake. I agree with both of their points, so I don't want to sound redundant, but I definitely agree with all the points that they made as well. But one thing for me that was, I don't want to say surprise, but made a lasting impression on me was right out the gate, and that was the interview process. This was my very first private sector experience interview, and it was the alignment interview. And that was really key to me because I was looking at mission, culture, and values. So it's funny, Josh, you mentioned mission, because that was one of the things that I was very curious about, because I consider myself a very multi-passionate person. So that mission matters, the culture matters, the values certainly matter. So to have the alignment interview out the gate, and then the holistic approach to the whole process, that all stakeholders interviewed me, from legal to the people business partner to my directs, my boss, my peers. That holistic approach was really impressive to me, and I thought it was very well executed. And the holistic approach also applies to other avenues, such as even the feedback that we give each other and our performance appraisal system. And that's something that is, I think, so very important. And one of the things that kind of stuck out to me, and now that I have over a year in tech industry, one thing that I really enjoy is the efficiency and the fast-paced environment. So if something makes sense, we analyze it, we dig in, we do what we need to do, and we execute. And to have that execution rigor is something that has been just wonderful to experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I guess mine is a bit different, similar but different. As we say in this region, same but different. The first thing that struck me was something that surprised me from the get-go. As I mentioned in my intro, I stumbled into tech, but it was very interesting. And Brian, it's sort of like us reminiscing the past. My KPIs or my bottom lines that I got from Brian and others on the team was not based on business bottom line. So I was very surprised, right? I'm not talking about how much revenue are we bringing in and how we progressing the business, but really it came back to how are we keeping our users safe, how are we going to be judicious in building out new products. So I was surprised by that, because I always thought from the outside looking in that my KPIs working in a for-profit entity would always be driven by profit considerations. So that was something that was refreshing. And I think another thing that is not too much of a surprise, but it was an interesting fact to consider and have at the back of my mind as I was doing my work, is even if the mission is something that's based on a value or principle, my remit was the whole of Asia. Whereas when I was working for government, my remit was Singapore. The national construct and what is national interest is clear. So your principles are tied to certain outcomes that are sort of static. Whereas when you're looking after the whole region, your principles need to sort of consider what is the outcome of these principles in a different country all the time, or in a different subset of the region all the time. How I'm thinking about how a product tracks within Southeast Asia is different from how I would consider it in South Asia. And if you break it down into different countries, it's even more different. And I think that was an interesting challenge that I sort of came into realization as I went along with the work. And it was very difficult for me and for my teams to be an interlocutor of that point of what we need to take into consideration. Because sometimes when a big tech company operates from a particular location, be it out of China or be it out of the US, such differences in perspective and differences in the way values are implemented on the ground or sort of are realized on the ground is harder to enunciate. So that was something that I found interesting and I enjoyed. Over time, I enjoyed, because it keeps you honest about how you are serving different communities around the world.
So all of you come from sort of, security backgrounds in government in one way or another. Moving into the trust and safety world, there's obviously a sort of a core security component, but the workforce in trust and safety is not primarily folks with backgrounds like yours, like mine. What has it been like to sort of integrate with a workforce that brings really different perspectives? You've got a lot of sort of, tech do-gooders. You've got a lot of folks that have really seen, that they may come from an underrepresented community that has really, been on the receiving end of some of the nasty things that happen on the internet. What has it been like coming from a government security perspective, which frankly, I think is treated with some mistrust by some of those folks sometimes? What has that been like, and how do you deal with those hurdles?
So I'll start. I mean, I think, I'll channel the prosecutor vibe here, right? Like, because it's my background. So the thing that's interesting about being a prosecutor is, to be a good prosecutor, I would argue, you really need to make sure that you're like finding the perspective of everybody. You're understanding all the facts. You are considering all the facts, because if you get it wrong and then you go in front of a jury, you're going to lose, and the stakes are really high. And so I think like channeling that when you're when you're running a team is important, because like it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what level you are in the company, your perspective matters, and you may have some nugget of wisdom or greatness that if I don't work really hard to understand, I'm setting myself up for failure as a leader. And so I think like that, experience for me, as a former prosecutor helps. Same thing as a policymaker, when we were sort of working to gather the perspectives of the interagency, for example, that's like, and some of you have experience with this, but like state never agreed with DHS, never agreed with DOJ, never agreed with FBI, never agreed with DOD, right? And so like even understanding that that's all government, like that's a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives on the world. And you had to try to like pull all that in, because when you're advising potentially the president, to try to make the best decision, like you really want to make sure you kind of eke that out of people, all that greatness. So I think that's pretty cool, and I think has benefited the team and the company my team and the company as a result.
Yeah, I'll follow up to that, Josh. Yeah, I had very similar sentiment to that, and I kind of wondered what that would look like as well, if I'm being very transparent. But I've seen, or at least in my personal experience, that diversity of experience, that diversity of thought, diversity of just our different career trajectories was really welcomed and embraced. And that is something that I thought, wow, this is really great, because I wasn't sure how it would look, but just kind of how Josh just discussed, you crafted it so well that you have all of these different opinions. Some can be very strong opinions, and how to navigate that and to effectively communicate and kind of navigate through all of that, and then kind of come together on common ground. We can always do that, right? And something that I kind of observed is, if you can solve problems, if you can analyze data sets, if you can mitigate risk, if you're flexing that muscle in the government, you can flex it, in private sector, right? So it's the same things, and it's just kind of applying it maybe to a different avenue or discipline or whatever it might be. And even though the day-to-day might look a little bit different, those kind of things are really core and at the heart of kind of what we do, and how we can have that positive impact and keep our platform trustworthy and safe.
Maybe I'll jump in. My background while I was in government was not in the security sector. So I came from education. So it was more social reform and social policy. And then I kind of changed and pivot when I was doing my research and things like that. But what is interesting is in the fact that, Brian, you even asked that question, because I think it's very useful for us to understand where we came from, and as a result of that, what may be our blind spots, so that when we come and work together as a cross-functional group, it's useful for us to understand, okay, maybe I have this point of view because that has been my experience thus far, and that's my background, that's how I look at things, right? And when you augment your team and you bring together a range of stakeholders, you can also then understand, okay, I'm probably weaker at thinking about how this issue tracks when it's a social issue. Let's say if someone else on the team has this sort of background that can have help me plug the gap. So I think that's very useful and important. And a lot of my background in tech is in policy making, and we found that to be extremely useful when we're considering how to build out our team. So every time I hire for my team, I'm looking not just at a person's individual skill sets, but I'm also looking at how does this person augment the team that I already have, right? And for those of you not in the security sector, don't worry, there's a lot of space for you in the trust and safety sector. I've had people from the health services, I've had people from social policy, I have people with an economics background. So there's a space for you, right? There are things which you need to consider in terms of what are your skill sets, but there's also the substantive that you bring to the table, right? So a lot of us being security professional, we tend to look at issues with a very hard perspective of like, is someone gonna die? But then if you come from a social background, you're like, hold on, I need to think about the implications on society, you know? So that kind of perspective is important. And I think to be aware of that is to check your blind spot and think about how you bring a team together.
Mhm.
So what I'll say is just I think going to your motives and like why maybe if you started in government, why you were there, right? And I think it was to be of service, right? To be of service to the people that you are working with, to be in service to the nation or the organization. And I think like maybe that's something that surprises me and energizes me about the field, but I feel that with my colleagues that we do very much feel in service to each other because we oftentimes are confronting difficult things, but also just the nature of the work. It's there's a sense of importance around it as your product touches people. And so like I kind of am always thinking about and talking about with our teams that we're in kind of the most human business. Like this is the most important business you can kind of be in within our org structure because it's where the humanity kind of comes through. And so I think like when it comes to building teams, maintaining your team, the extension of kind of that dignity and respect and appreciation for the lived experience, the day-to-day experience of the folks that are like at the very front lines. Like if you're working with a BPO or you have third-party partners that are in direct contact with difficult material, or you have a contract and FTE blend. I think like really appreciating the incredible kind of like aperture that are on trust and safety teams, the privilege that comes with that, right? Like being in this human business together and making that like enterprise work is really, I think it's really rewarding. I think it is something that is different than, kind of government service in other ways, like accountability. I feel like the accountability is very strong in the private sector, right? Like delivery of outcomes, being some cases more selective, the opportunity to have like some of the more freedom to kind of build more diverse teams or cultivate a certain kind of skill set. So I think there's just it's a really like rich topic, and I think we could probably talk about it all day, but I think there are pieces that really connect it, but then there are some things that kind of really stand it apart and differentiate. But I think diversity, from my military service, like having a service that looks like the nation it represents and that is inclusive is important for like how we present ourselves on a global stage. And similar in trusted safety teams, as we think about safety, security, the experience that our customers feel, it's so important to have kind of representation and to have diversity of thought and approach in our teams.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you guys how you made the decision to jump into trust and safety, and then what advice would you give to folks considering a similar sort of jump? I mean, what should compel them to do it, and frankly, are there circumstances in which people shouldn't make those kind of jumps? And I don't know where to start. Maybe Rebecca, do you want to start with you?
Sure, I'd love to go. So I'm very passionate about this question. I've been asked several times in the last year or so, like, wait, you used to do this and now you do this. How did you do this? What did that look like? So I'm very passionate about this. And I think really, if you boil it down in the nuts and bolts, it's really to know your why, right? I know that Drake has, stated several times, kind of being of service and, mission. And I'm also a very mission-driven person. And so to kind of look at where can I be of service and what that calling looks like, right? And so I served in one capacity, that chapter closed, and I'm ready to kind of serve in a different way and to impact society in a different way. And when I was looking at that transition and kind of, where would I best land? What does the tech industry have? Where could I be of service? Where can I make the greatest impact? There was, a few different disciplines that kind of, came to the surface, but trust and safety was one that, wow, I keep seeing these different, jobs posting, and it's pretty darn similar to kind of different things that kind of, my experience would lend to. And I may have alluded to this earlier, but the framework and the lens in which I was looking through was that mission, culture, and values. So kind of before I did anything, I was aggressively researching these companies, right? I'm listening to my prospective CEO on a podcast. I'm reading articles. How did the company start? Because I wanted to make sure that I was making an informed decision, right? And so I cannot overstate doing your research, knowing your why. What are your non-negotiables, right? So for me, it could look different than, my fellow panelists here. And so it could be as simple as I only want to work from home, or I do not want to work from home. So all of these things matter, and to kind of have a good framework in which you're approaching that. And my teams know that I always say this is you're CEO of your career. No one is going to do it for you. And so you want to make sure that you understand what your skill sets are, translate them so beautifully. And really pay attention to the interview process as well. I will state that because I believe interviews are two-way streets. So we want to make sure we're not only being interviewed, we interview that prospective company, and it can be a wonderful journey. So those would be my kind of initial thoughts on it. And I don't know who wants to go next.
I'm happy to go next. I'm sort of going to give a differing perspective. Having worked in a few big tech companies, I think what you see on the outside may not always accurately reflect what's going on the outside, especially if you index on like the media. I love the media, by the way, since this is a public recording, generally. So what I think you really need to consider is the people, for me. And if you ask me when I first stumbled into tech, whether I was that conscious about what I was doing, I would say no. But having grown in maturity, wisdom, i.e. growing older in life, I've had time to reflect about what I value in my career and what pivots in my career had gone well and what had not. And it's really, for me, always had boiled down to people. I'm not saying this because Brian's on the panel, but the first thing you need to look out for is who is your hiring manager. Because at the end of the day, your day in, day out, your lived reality is going to be, you reporting to that person. Can you live with that? Do the two of you click? And likewise, when I'm hiring, I'm also looking at whether or not me and that other person can work together, So that's the first thing. Two, who would be my immediate team members and other people I work closely with? Because again, at the end of the day, you want to wake up in the morning wanting to speak to these people, wanting to work with these people. So that's your lived reality. And I would advise this to anyone thinking about what their next career move would be. Think about those like 8 to 10 hours you're going to spend a day at work. Who do you want to do that with, right? So think about people. And the second thing I would look at would be the KPIs for that role. At the end of the day, in the interview process, ask the hiring manager, ask the recruiter, what does success look like in this role? What are my KPIs, right? And if you can identify with those, then yes, go ahead with it. When should you not consider a career in tech? This is something I've had to deal with when interviewing people. If you are someone who needs a lot of structure, who needs clarity in terms of who are decision makers in a particular project or in a particular process, then big tech may not be, or tech in general may not be the space for you. It's going to be messier. It's going to be less clear about what the hierarchy looks like. It's sometimes not clear who the decision makers are. You can kind of get stuck because there's so many voices and it's flat. And it's okay to say that's not me, because everyone thinks like, oh, it's great, to not have structure and be a lot more agile. It's kind of cool. But if that's not you, then that's not you. And that's fine because we're all different, right? So that's when I would advise someone against considering a role in tech, unless it's a very particular process-driven role, unless it's a very particular role. In general, tech tends to be a lot messier than government.
I'd like to jump in there because I think that's kind of like where I guess my point would come. I think like one of the things that like we've been talking, we do make it sound like it's like a one-way street. Like you're in government service, and then like you pull the parachute, and then you never have to go back there again. And like I've come back and forth, right? And like I think that one of the things in talking about like a career path or a decision to get in trust and safety and like where it resonates, there's also like what feeds back, and like that point about tech being messy, and that like these organizations, there's a lot of self-organization, there's not a lot of rules, but there's a lot of norms, but like somehow things have to get done, right? I think that's where I've brought structure with me from the government in my roles in trust and safety and in ops, and help to kind of provide a little bit of structure, discipline around how we think about things, how we measure principles, from having to work with a big machine, right? And to having to influence those folks on the Hill.
Drake, how well has that worked? Has that been a hard thing? Have people like sort of accepted those rules? Because that is,
well, that's the thing, right? It's like a spoonful of sugar, right? Like you don't call them rules, right? Like you do disguise it a bit, right? Like when you talk about like, the jobs that people need done, right? And like, how do we build a machine around this? Like, how do we self-organize and create things that are repeatable for us or are going to help us achieve scale? Like, we're putting rules in place. So like, I think it just has to be done in the right tone and tenor. Like it has to be done with utility. Like you have to be principles first, but a lot of like, being able to navigate, this era of efficiency and being able to do, more and show your value, that may not be like one of the hallmarks people think of the US government, but there is, oversight in how we spend money and how we do appropriations. And so like, we definitely, like, I bring some of that with me, but then also some of the more like agile, purpose oriented, less structured, ways of working. I've definitely brought that back with me to the Pentagon. And like, it didn't necessarily make me friends right away on the joint staff, but I think like, through some pretty like frank discussions, like some of that was more included as we were talking about like the joint warfighting concept and some of like, the ways we have to get after these, bigger problems that we have on an international stage and like how we cope with that. And it comes from less rigidity, more, a little bit more dynamic thinking. And so it's like interesting how you can kind of borrow from one to use in the other. There's probably more similarity than difference when we're talking about big organizations. And so like, I guess my point's not so much about trust and safety focus, but in some ways it is, where it's like, I've been able to kind of bring some of the ops, some of the structure, some of the like ways of thinking that are kind of outside of the policy discipline. And I think, that's where you inherently just brush up against it in a bureaucracy or in the government every day.
I'll address the three issues, but I'll take the first two and like maybe one foul swoop. So the pluses and minuses of trust and safety in terms of like being attractive to me could be the same reason why it's unattractive to others, which is like trust and safety is like it's like the old World War II planes where like the gremlins were on them, like taking it apart while they were flying. I don't know if any of these old analogies, there's this old thing about a gremlin that would just, take the plane apart while you're flying it. So that's sort of like, you've heard the analogy of the plane flying and you're building while flying. I think it's more like there's a plane, but it's like falling apart and somebody's actively trying to take it apart while you're kind of keep trying to build it. And like, that sounds to me like fun. But if to you, that sounds awful, then don't do trust and safety. So that's sort of like one response. Also, and during the interviews, we ask people this two questions. One is like, are you comfortable with the uncomfortable? Right? You have to be. And then the other one is sometimes decisions are not going to go your way. Do you have a red line? or what's your reaction going to be when ultimately a decision is made that you're very uncomfortable with? So I think those are sort of important points. On the process point that Drake was talking about, like, I actually do think, you know, being a lawyer or being a prosecutor is all about due process, right? And I think, although Evelyn would disagree because she published a big article about why we shouldn't follow due process concepts, but in any event, I think it's actually using that framework is helpful. And I think process can be good if it enables you to move faster, and it builds trust, and not just trust with like the people that use our product, but internal trust with stakeholders. So if you build a process that allows you to move quickly, you know, whether it's building the next thing, the trust and safety solution, or building the next product, or making decisions, or a framework for making decisions, like it ends up building more trust in the organization and allows you to be more limber and agile. And so that's how typically I use it internally to Zoom, to say like, look, you let me build this process, it's going to make us work faster. You can trust me more. I'll show you my homework. Everything is repeatable, auditable, scalable, and you can watch it happen. And that helps, right? And I think that some of that does come from the former government perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly say as you know, hiring manager in these situations, it's one of the reasons why I hired folks from government was the ability to build process, and the fact that I felt like I needed help doing that in some cases, right? We got a really interesting question via the Q&A function, and so others should be putting in interesting questions via the Q&A function. I hope folks do. But this one, it speaks to what should folks that are working in trust and safety now that are considering a move to government be thinking about, right? And I do think that you know, we've seen this move now from government into trust and safety, and we're starting to see more of the inverse. And overall, I hope that this is a really healthy process, because there's still this huge understanding gap between sort of regulatory bodies and trust and safety teams, and generally. I hope that helps fill it, but what advice would you give to folks from trust and safety moving towards government?
So I'll start with that one. So one is like, and thanks to Charlotte and TSPA, we're doing a pretty good job at this, but like, I don't think still people understand what trust and safety is like widely, and how applicable it is to like almost many careers in government. We get confused with security a lot, like, you know, no,
like cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity, no, that's not us. Although like a big portion of what is necessary for cybersecurity enforcement does fall into our you know, our ambit. So I think the fact that every government agency is going to try to regulate platforms and platform safety means that if you're interested in moving into the government, there are going to be job opportunities. But I think it was Rebecca or maybe Naz that said, like, be the CEO of your own career. So the advice I give to people is like, don't put yourself in a box, like understand the skill sets that you've developed as a trust and safety professional, which are substantial and applicable in many different things in the context of what the government does and different government agencies do. And don't box yourself in. Look at the skills that the government agency is looking for, even if it doesn't say trust and safety or whatever, and then use that as a mechanism to find your way into government. But there will be jobs in the government that you can find.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in and echo what Josh is saying. When I think about a job, or when I think about hiring someone, there are three aspects that I look into, right? One is definitely the skill set, which Josh has talked about. Then the other aspect would be the substantive. What is the nature of the role that this person has been in? And as a result of that, what is the subject matter or content expertise that they bring with them, right? So you may have made policies, so you're pretty relevant in terms of policy making. What type of policies have you been looking into? Online safety, maybe a lot of online safety regulators would be relevant there. You've looked into privacy issues, so privacy policy, any company or government entity looking at privacy policies may want to hire you. So you also need to think about, what role did I play within the trust and safety space, because trust and safety is a huge spectrum, right? You've got policy people, you've got product managers, you've got project managers, you've got escalation specialists, you've got all sorts of people there. So you really need to consider, what is the subject matter expertise that I bring with me, and is that relevant to the role that I'm looking into? And then the third one would be your networks. So skills, subject matter, and do you bring any sort of network? In some roles within government, some types of networks are useful and important. Say, for example, if you're an escalation specialist, then your network in terms of helping this government entity reach out to stakeholders when a crisis happens may be useful. If you're a policymaker, then your network in the NGO, academic, various types of stakeholders may be important. So really, at the end of the day, when you're looking at a job and transitioning, think about these three areas, right? The most obvious one would be skills, but then also what's the subject matter expertise and also the networks that I bring in. And then the other one is, you're not going to be wearing jeans to work, most likely, if you're going to move to government. So be comfortable with that. I'm just looking at my wardrobe sometimes and like, oh gosh, I don't think I can transition out because I don't have the right clothes for it.
Yeah,
I don't even fit in my suits anymore. I've been sitting on this chair way too much.
I know. I haven't worn my business suit in, gosh, I don't know how long. So, but yes, Josh and Naz, they made all relevant points, and maybe just to kind of dig, even a little bit deeper, like into the skill sets, if you will. There's so many, and kind of, as I indicated earlier, if you can do it in one discipline, you can do it, in the other. Risk mitigation, emotional intelligence, analyzing, problem solving, any type of investigative experience or analytical experience. How are you with team building and working in that collaborative environment? Because in trust and safety, you don't work in a silo, you work with each other, you work with other teams. And so that emphasis on teamwork and team building is huge. And again, and this is very dependent on what role you're currently in or what role you're looking potentially to assume, but strategic planning to drive initiatives and having a growth mindset, I think, is critical, because looking at, whatever challenges or issues you're currently facing and how you're able to successfully navigate that is critical. And networking cannot be overstated, in my opinion, either. Is if you know somebody, talk to them. If you know someone that knows somebody, talk to them, right? The more information you have, the better to make an informed decision, especially if it's something that maybe you haven't been a part of before, right? And so I know that I definitely use that framework myself, and I talked to, and I joked that I interrogated so many people because I wanted to know what it was like and what they felt, and if that was going to look right for me, which again, it can look very, very different from everybody. And yes, the attire. I am very, very comfortable all the time. So what do you think, Drake?
Well, I think I won't belabor the attire point, but I will say that I think, like, if you don't come from the government and you're thinking about like going in, it is a real consideration when you think about your career timelines and like hiring processes and things like that potentially taking significantly longer. And so like thinking about like what your transition period would look like, and in some ways, just with the fairness and hiring practices in the US government, right? Like that being a little bit different than, you're not going to kind of like network into the hiring manager and like have a direct conversation about the intention and then like bring on somebody that they've worked with before. Like it goes into general applicant pools. There's a lot less transparency. And so just kind of the nature of the hiring process can be so different. But like once on the ground, I think, folks have brought up like really great kind of points about like considerations on how you fit in, like being able to fit in understanding, critical thinking, how systems work, particularly how tech systems work. At least in my limited experience, like working in, the five-sided building, like a lot of folks didn't really understand or perceived in a very different way how, like media worked or digital media worked, and like what that meant to them. Like their relative value of like understanding a Twitter or a Meta was very different than like what Twitter or Meta would probably perceive of itself, or those users are probably thinking about. And then like being able to maybe bridge some of those understanding gaps or provide a different perspective, I found to be super rewarding. And I found people, once like that trust that kind of Josh talked about is established, like being able to really help, people think about things in a different way. And I think, that's a skill that's just really common across that aperture of trust and safety professionals. And so to reemphasize whomever said, don't wait to see, safety or trust and safety in a federal posting, like you probably won't, but I would say like cut a wide path on where you could plug in and think that your diverse experience could be really valuable to help people think in a different way. But I don't have much else to add.
Yeah, so we turn this a little bit, and because we've talked a lot about, we've talked about some of the challenges of moving into trust and safety and some of the good things that you bring when you come from government. There's a good question that's come in Q&A, and whoever submitted this question also submitted it on Eventbrite, and that persistence deserves recognition. So we're going to ask the question, which is like, is there a risk that you bring the bad stuff from your old government bureaucratic job into into the tech sector? And what are some of those bad habits? Did you bring bad habits that you wish you would have been able to jettison more quickly?
That's a tough one, because like we all would never want to admit that we brought those bad habits with us.
Right.
But no, I think
of course, nobody here brought those bad habits.
I would take the contrary view. I think it's a great question, but I would take the contrary view. Actually, in my experience, I've found that tech is much more siloed, and there's a lack of communication than sometimes in the government. However, the government is very bureaucratic. What that says to me as somebody that came from the government is I've learned a lot of lessons as to what doesn't work. and coming into the tech environment where you can apply the effectiveness that you learned while being in the government under those parameters is actually really helpful. So just that may have been a confusing answer, but the gist of it is this: like, I learned how to operate in a government environment relatively successfully. I mean, I don't know if anybody's going to watch this is going to disagree, but I think so. And that was in that sort of environment. I learned what I didn't think was effective. I learned where I can maybe improve things if I had the opportunity. And then moving to tech, like, it's been a focus. Like, I think Drake talked about this too. Like, how can I look at the problem set and become really much more efficient, and then break down the silos that I see? But as I said, in tech, I actually have found it to be more siloed and sometimes challenging than even in the federal government.
If I can, like, I think we were racing to make this point, and I think like there is a beautiful governor on us, and that is the free will of these companies, the people in these companies that we work with, right? Like in a bureaucracy, like there are maybe inculcated processes, there are rules, but like in tech, there really aren't. And so as you bring things in, right, it has to be a helpful tool. It has to show utility, or else people are going to opt out because they can. And so I think that there's like a nice governor in the free will of the people there. And so if something like, if you have a decent adoption rate to your process, it means it probably works and it solves a job for people and it's good. And like, if people aren't opting in and it's, you're noticing that you're treading water, then like it probably doesn't. But I don't think, it has like the same, the danger of carrying it over. What I'll say though, that and I think maybe this is also I don't want to make Josh's point for him or speak for him, but what I notice is that in tech, folks don't necessarily want to own the decision or accountability. And that's where things can get siloed, because a lot of folks will want to, talk about what should happen, but there's not always like a line forming to put their name on the decision. And so I think a skill you have to learn in the federal government is like how the stakeholder network works and how you work the processes to get one thing from one executive agency to another, or to get it in front of the right subcommittee to get funded. And sometimes our organizations in tech can be just like that. You have to build a coalition of, support. You have to get executive buy-in. You have to make people feel comfortable. And there is like a little bit of a process, and there is a little bit of a method to going and doing that, particularly in sensitive subject matters or things that could be potentially like, high profile in the press. So I think there's a good check and balance in people's free will in tech. But I also think like we do bring some understanding when you can decouple yourself from how frustrated the process or the bureaucracy can make you, and think about how you build things that work for you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to jump in here, and the question was framed within the context of the US, a lot of US government professionals in the mix. So I'm going to give a perspective of someone from outside the US working with teams within the US. And it might be a bit controversial, but I think it's a fair point. I think working with a lot of colleagues based out of the US from a previous government position, sometimes their awareness of their political position is not clear. I mean, being in government, especially within the American context, is bipartisan, right? Your networks usually come from a particular point of view, and you need to be hugely conscious of yourself to recognize that, hey, I may be making this evaluation as a result of my political leaning. And a lot of times people are, but it's not always the case. And I think this is where having diversity in a team is useful, because I found that when you have someone from outside that sphere coming in, you may just question, I'm sorry, coming from a point of view where I'm not mixed and I don't understand the politics of your country, can you please understand how do you arrive at this decision? And this is particularly so when you're dealing with gray area issues. So I come from policy, and we deal with the gray all the time. And I've gone through BLM, I've gone through dog whistling by political leaders, etc. And sometimes us coming in and saying, I think we need to check this a bit. Can you help me understand? Because I don't understand the politics of what's going on within your society. And when we consistently do this, then it makes sense. But we all have to recognize that a government position or government role means you've been steeped in the politics of it. Your networks are steeped in a particular politics. And I'm using the example of the US, but it's the same for various different countries, right? And we always need to check that, especially when we're dealing with a gray area issue, and especially when you're working in tech, that's social media. Because at the end of the day, the decisions that you make have implications for communities, societies, and narratives. And so having some of those awareness is important. And I think it's not always easy to have self-awareness, and it's probably easier if you have a more diverse team that asks some of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm de-lurking here because we are at time. This hour flew. I just want to say thank you so much to all of our panelists this evening for sharing about this journey. Thank you, Brian, for putting all these panelists together and developing all these questions. Thank you to the audience for asking more questions. We did say in the Q&A that we will be posting this to our public YouTube, and so we hope that we'll see some of you there. Some of you are probably watching this now on YouTube, and thank you for doing so. If you are, at the end of this session thinking, oh, actually, this was very useful, I would like to have more content like this. Great news. That is what TSPA exists to do. If you go to tspa.org, you'll find all of our resources for current trust and safety professionals, people who are interested in pursuing a career in trust and safety. We don't have many resources for people who want to get out of trust and safety and do government, but apparently you need a suit. So that is where I would direct you first. Two things just before I let you go. We have a couple of big events coming up for our community this year. May 31st, we will be holding our first regional summit for EMEA, and that is going to be in Dublin, Ireland. It's going to be a fantastic event. If you go to summit.tspa.org/EMEA Summit 2023, or if you just go to our website, tspa.org, you'll be able to get registration information there. That's free for members, folks. So if you just want a little day of trust and safety, night on the town, it's included. So get registered. A couple more days to have your registration there. Next up is going to be TrustCon. That is our big annual conference. We're doing it in San Francisco this year, July 11th, 12th, and 13th. Alas, it's not totally free for members, but you get a great discount. So members, I hope we see you there. That is also open to non-members. And so if you're curious about this world, you want to learn more, TrustCon is the place to be for that. And I hope we'll see all of you on the panel there. Thank you so much for being here with us, and have a great day, everyone. Stay safe out there.